Talk a little bit about cell-cell signaling. Now, you did spend quite a bit of time talking about cell-cell signaling in ANP1 when you talked about neurons, right? Neurons are a cell type adapted to cell-cell signaling, right? If we draw a sort of standard multipolar neuron here, there's a branching at the end. The synaptic bulbs out here. Hopefully you remember this kind of stuff. Right? Nucleus and the soma. Right? If you recall, right, some important cell structures here, like the dendrites on this end of the cell, right? Those are the dendrites. This is the axon. That's the axon. Right? There's the synaptic bulbs or synaptic knobs, depending on what you guys called them. And then we have our target cells out here where synapses are occurring. And the blue, and it could be another neuron, but I'm drawing it sort of as this red cell, which could be anything we want it to be. But the whole idea is that information is conveyed along this cell to adjust the activity of these target cells out here, right? These guys. So that's one form of cell-cell signaling. And the benefits of neuronal signaling is that it's very fast, right? It's very fast. The transmission of information is blazingly quick, right? Think about how fast you pull your hand off of something that's hot, right? That involves neuronal signaling. And so it's very good for things that have to happen quickly. It's also, very complex information processing, if we think about how our central nervous system works, right? And so it serves a lot of purposes and has a lot of sort of adaptive features that are good for complex processing and very rapid responses. But sometimes we and by the way, let's focus on another component here. What it does is, as we've discussed previously, is it reduces the limitations of, gets around the limitations of poor diffusion, right? If you were to rely on the diffusion of a chemical signal, let's say we don't have an axon in these dendrites, or I'm sorry, in these telodendria here, the branchings at the end, right? And this cell were to release a chemical. Right, here's a chemical, and it would have to diffuse, and that's non-directional, right, to get to this target cell. Well, depending upon how far away that target cell is, we could be talking, days, months, years to get that signal there. And so, the rapidity of neuronal transmission overcomes the weakness of diffusion over distance to convey a signal, right? We use these chemical molecules, in the case of a neuron, a neurotransmitter, to convey information to other cells. Now, if we want to talk about other types of cell-cell signaling, and again, we're moving towards our endocrine function here, right? But we have to sort of lay out the array of cell-cell signaling so we understand how it fits in. Not all cells are far away from, cells that they're trying to modify the activity of. And sometimes it's literally the same cell. So in this scenario we have here at the top, this is called autocrine regulation. In autocrine regulation, a cell releases a chemical signal, right? That's these little red dots I'm making here. And it acts back on the exact same cell that secreted it. Sounds a little weird, right? Now, keep in mind, right, I can draw another cell of the same type over here, try to make it the same shape, right? Look pretty much the same. And this this chemical messenger could act on this cell as well, and that would still be called autocrine. So autocrine is when the chemical messenger acts on the cell that releases it or on the exact same type of cell that's adjacent to it, right? So if you think about epithelial cells or muscle cells, oftentimes they are next to many, many other of those same type of cells. And so our chemical messenger could act on the same cell or on an adjacent cell of the same type. That's called autocrine. And that's a form of local control, right? We want to put this under, right? Autocrine would be a form of autoregulation, right? Keep in mind, we talked about that when we talked about homeostasis, right? Sometimes the control is very local, and this is definitely a form of local control, and so we can also call it autoregulation, right? That's the broader category, right? Yes, it's autocrine, but autocrine is a form of autoregulation. All right, we could also have a cell release a chemical messenger, right? Again, highlighting here in red, that acts on an adjacent cell that is not of the same type. And in that scenario, it's called paracrine, right? So paracrine is, again, a form of autoregulation, right? Because it is acting locally, remember intrinsic, right? Coming from within. This is control that's occurring at the local level of the tissue, right? It's not requiring input, right, of the nervous system, right? Remember this, right, is a form of extrinsic regulation because the control comes from outside the local area, outside of the local tissue, right? We've got these axons coming from the central nervous system all the way into whatever tissue we wanted to talk about, whatever these red cells are, right, to control them. That's coming from outside or extrinsic. Okay, if we move down, here's another sort of oddball one. It's called endocrine regulation, and that's when the chemical messenger isn't even released. Right, here it is. It's being produced internally, and it's having effects without on the same cell without actually being released from the cell. Right, so intra means within. Right, and so that's obviously a local control. We could label that as autoregulation as well. Right. Now, again, let's move on to our another form of extrinsic regulation, though, right? So down here at the bottom, we have endocrine cells. So endocrine cells are hormone secreting cells. And honestly, the difference between a hormone and a paracrine or an autocrine agent or a neurotransmitter, right? We could point out our neurotransmitters being released here, put some little dots in here, right? Being released by our, hopefully you can see those, right? Putting little green dots at our synapse here. Those are the neurotransmitter molecules being released, right onto our target cell. Well, here's our neurotransmitter, or sorry, our chemical messenger being released. And there are some molecules that are, the same molecule is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. A really good example is norepinephrine, right? But so our endocrine cells releasing this hormone, but now it's not just diffusing through the interstitium as it is up here onto onto an adjacent cell, right? What's happening is it's diffusing into the bloodstream, right? It could diffuse, to an adjacent cell, but that adjacent cell has to have receptors. Note this little V right here. You can see that, right? These V's indicate or meant to indicate receptors that make this cell sensitive to that particular chemical agent, that chemical signal. Well, our hormone here is in the interstitial fluid. Let's say there are no cells that are adjacent that have receptors, or even if there are, they could respond, and in which case it's acting in a paracrine or autocrine fashion. But if the hormone gets into the bloodstream, change my color, right? The hormone gets into the bloodstream here, off it goes, right? It's into the general circulation. It's going to pass through the heart, right? With the heart down here. And now it is, right? It's everywhere. It's in the bloodstream, and it can leave the blood vessels, right, to enter any given tissue. And hormones don't know where to go, They're just traveling by pressure-driven flow through the blood vessels, and then they diffuse out in another capillary bed somewhere else. But if they come across a cell that expresses receptors for that particular hormone, then guess what? Right? We get a binding, and we're going to alter the activity of this target cell. And that is endocrine control, right? Hormone secretion into the bloodstream, right? A blood-borne carried chemical messenger that results, in the change in activity of this target cell, right? Blood-borne chemical messenger carried to its target cells and alters the activity. Now, there is one other version of this, and that's when a neuron, right? This is also a neuron, just like we saw before, releases its chemical messenger. Let's make it a different color. Make it purple. Right? So here's this, right? It's a neurotransmitter, right? Well, it is and it isn't, right? It's being released by a neuron, but it's not really a neurotransmitter because it's not acting at a synapse the way it is up here, right? This is a synapse, right? This isn't a synapse, really, right? Because that's the target cells are not the wall of the capillary here. The target cells are over here, right? Here are the target cells. And so this neurohormone, we're going to call it, is traveling around just like our green hormone from our endocrine cells. And so this purple molecule is also a hormone, but we're going to call it a neurohormone, right? Because it's coming from a neuron. And that is neuroendocrine control. And again, we can lump it together, and often people will, they leave off the neuroendocrine part, the neuro part, and just call it endocrine. But some hormones do come from neurons. A good example are the posterior pituitary hormones, as well as some from the hypothalamus, which actually the posterior pituitary hormones come from the hypothalamus, but even some others from the hypothalamus are released by neurons into the bloodstream, where they can then access our target cells. Right? The key characteristics or adaptive purposes of endocrine function is that it disperses our signal quite widely, right? That is very different from neural, which is very targeted, right? The only cells that are going to respond are the ones that are innervated, right, and have synapses. Here, any cell with a receptor can respond, right, to these hormones. The downsides of endocrine is it's a bit slower, right? We have to actually we have to diffuse into the bloodstream, then we have to be carried by the bloodstream, then we have to diffuse out of the bloodstream, right? So it's much, much slower. You wouldn't want to rely on hormonal control to get your hand off of a hot stove, right? Because it would take you, a better part of a minute to realize that your hand is burning, right? That would be bad. But for many other things like controlling blood pressure or growth or reproduction and metabolism, right? Hormones work just fine. We don't need that blazingly fast speed. And our target tissues are more broadly dispersed. And so we can just sort of dump this hormone into the bloodstream and have it delivered almost everywhere. And again, the target tissues determine the actions by expressing receptors. Right? These receptors determine who will and who will not respond to a particular hormone. All right, those are the categories of cell-cell signaling. Right? We have neuronal, which is very fast and can be short-acting. We have our forms of autoregulation that are acting very locally, right, via the interstitial fluid between cells. And then we have our blood-borne messengers of the endocrine and neuroendocrine variety here that act a little bit more slowly, but more broadly because they can go to essentially any target tissue.